Hi everyone, this is Takatoshi Shibayama, the host of the Future Design Podcast. I took a break from publishing episodes for 3 weeks. I apologize for listeners who have been expecting an episode during this time. I had to focus on my daytime job and that took me away from the podcast. But last week I met with an old friend from Jiu-Jitsu on the mats, and he told me he hasn't missed an episode and really enjoyed it. He mentioned that some of the other members of the gym are listening it too. Man, I gotta say, I had no idea, but it really motivated me to continue this podcast, so thanks to all you guys. And thanks again, Mr. R. You know who you are. I really think this is the beauty of Jiu-Jitsu. Everyone we practice with comes from different backgrounds, but we show up and put it all out in the mats. It doesn't matter who you are, but what you are. Hey guys, I'm back again. So for the first time listeners, this podcast looks to empower listeners with perspectives on how we can challenge the social norm and evolve with better understanding of philosophy, spirituality, and ethics. Empowered individuals can have much stronger voice and influence in bringing about revolutionary changes in the world, whether you're building businesses or technologies. My guests and I speak about social constructs that are commonly accepted in the world today that's not working anymore, and how to rebuild them with ethical values to create a better future. In this episode, we have Cordell France, the CEO of Seekar Technologies, a company that uses AI analyzing images like body scans, videos for emotions, temperature, and movement to detect medical conditions, sports analytics, or human life defense. We talk about how AI models should be built with ethical considerations, as it can be a double-edged sword. It can enhance human productivity and longevity, but it can also do the opposite. I'm quite certain that the cat is already out of the hat. And what we hear is the positive use cases, but in the background, it is used for effective killing and surveillance over private lives in ways you can't imagine. We need to be aware that the technology is out there and not fall into the trap of being complacent and demand for ethical use of AI. Whether you are a user or building businesses and technologies with AI, we must uphold the standard of its deployment and not let it run us over. So without further ado, please enjoy this week's episode. Welcome to the Future Design Podcast. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure to be on.
Great. It's my pleasure as well. And Cordell, you are the CEO of Seekar Technologies that are building AI systems. Right now, you're building these technologies around the medical equipment. But before I go deep dive into the world of AI, because it's a really interesting topic, I picked this up twice before, and I believe everybody has a different angle to this. So it'll be really great to understand who is Cordell France.
Sure. So I am an engineer by training and by discipline, primarily. Grew up on a farm in the United States, particularly in Idaho, and actually raising potatoes and wheat. And a lot of what we did on there was kind of actually led me to an interest in AI and robotics, particularly because on the farm, we had some autonomous steering software that we enabled on our machines. And that really kind of seeing these giant machines steer themselves and keep themselves straight and act in an autonomous fashion, you know, as a child, that's kind of, it's like something from sci-fi movies, right? It's something futuristic. And so that really kind of engraved in me that this is something I want to go into and do. And my father, thank goodness, was able to kind of help let me work on that stuff and troubleshoot and kind of get my hands dirty in that regard. So that kind of really catapulted my my interest into AI and robotics, and I've always been pretty proliferate in math, pretty good in math, and math's such a beautiful thing in my opinion, and being able to use that in combination with computer science and everything moving forward. Started coding at age 16, and actually started trying to code my calculus homework, and that turned out to be much harder feat than I anticipated it being. So, but it enabled me to get my feet dirty and learn a few programming languages, and then kind of just built on top of that from there. It's kind of been that motivating factor throughout my whole life. I've been really always had a curiosity in pattern recognition and finding a cause or an effect to a cause, right? Or a cause to an effect in very noisy data. So being able to really find meaning behind chaos and being able to, or maybe there's no meaning behind the way certain events happen, but kind of really trying to make sense out of why certain things happen, and really recognize a pattern or an equation to things, kind of really ingrained that I guess was leveraged from the fact that I excelled in math and really had a tremendous interest in robotics and artificial intelligence moving forward.
Yeah, that's a really interesting upbringing. I tried coding before and took, these online courses before, and I was really rubbish at it. So I do admire people who are in this world and coding. And I'm in the world of crypto, so I should know a little bit more about these things. But I'm more on the sales side, so completely different.
You weren't dropped on your head quite as many times as a baby, I take it.
Probably not. I do recall falling off a slide when I was a kid, but maybe that was probably one of the things that got me a little bit more towards the technology side of things. But you were talking about these cause and effects, which is actually a really interesting Buddhist concept as well, because the world is chaotic, and if you don't keep your mind clear, you actually don't see the cause and effect. And it seems like it translates quite a lot into the world of programming as well, because I do remember trying to code things and I always get mistakes, and then I go back to it and was like, why did this work? And then re-examining this thing over and over, these codes. So I do kind of see a bit of a similarity there. And just to go back a little bit into your farm, and you saw these autonomous vehicles running around. This must have been like 20 plus years ago. So could you just out of my curiosity, I would love to know how these vehicles are actually or handled or managed.
Yeah, so no, it was more than 20 years ago when I was first exposed to it, and it's quite interesting because agriculture had self-steering back in like the late 90s, early 2000s, where consumers had access to it. It wasn't really like a research effort. And now we're finally seeing it into like the consumer realm with autonomous vehicles on the road and everything. So it's interesting that it's kind of, it's you wouldn't think it would go that way. You think it'd be the other way around, like we would have had it for more of a consumer base before agriculture. But so that's kind of been an interesting trend to watch. But so these autonomous vehicles, or these tractors, this large equipment that are pulling these massive plows, these massive rigs behind them to help fertilize the field and till the field. They're controlled by a suite of electronics, and they've got a GPS sensor on the top of them. And originally you had to go set up like a small base station is what we call it. And it was like it's like a 5-foot tower that you have to go set up somewhere so that it had GPS access. Now there's a lot more GPS satellites, and it's a lot easier to get a GPS signal, so we don't have to go set that tower up. We can actually beam the signal directly to the tractor and the implement. But what's interesting is these vehicles are able to maintain like tenths of an inch of inaccuracy going through the field. So you have this field that, I mean, some of these passes that we're making are half mile, even 3/4 of a mile long. They're huge fields, and you're maintaining a tenth of an inch in accuracy all the way through these hills and valleys and crevices and everything, and going around things. It's really quite remarkable, especially with something it's that big and that heavy. But it's really managed. Everything's managed inside the cab, and so we have each tractor's got its own GPS, and each tractor's got its own sensor suite, and you can kind of tap into it with your phone if you want and see how the speed of, like my father's got an app on his phone in which he can see the speed at which everything's running and how accurate his GPS is being maintained and everything. But there's a lot of troubleshooting going on, at least initially, because it was such a newer technology, and trying to make sure that it didn't veer off course. And you have to make sure that when I was a kid, I had to make sure that I didn't fall asleep at the wheel, right? Because if it's driving itself, you have to babysit. And when you're younger, you kind of have that, you don't have as much drive to stay awake, and no caffeine, obviously. So you have to kind of make sure you're paying attention, and that you don't, in case something goes wrong, which things did go wrong, you're there to rectify and kind of fix things. So it's really quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. And from that, I'm sure I would have been really amazed by that technology, because it's just really running by its own, and with a very several inches of inaccuracy. I mean, even back 20 plus years ago, I mean, that's really amazing how accurate those technologies are. And now we have these ideas, concepts, and companies experimenting on autonomous vehicles. Obviously, I understand the complexity of riding with various cars around, people around, all these these events that you wouldn't really imagine usually happening, and then having to put down all that in code sounds like a really impossible thing to do. I mean, obviously you have to gather data, but no one car drive is always going to be the same, right? So how do you think that people are designing these autonomous vehicles? What is the better question is, what do they have in mind when they're actually creating these autonomous vehicles?
So it takes a lot of data in order to make these vehicles work, right? Especially in the ways of consumer vehicles, where you're exactly right. No drive is the same. People have different driving habits. Some people are a little more aggressive. So being able to use that data to train these artificial intelligence models to operate, you have one model that is going to learn from everybody and try to accommodate everyone's driving habits. And that's hard to do, because if we think about like the way our brain works, the state of my mind is the sum of all of my experiences and the sum of all the data I've collected throughout my life, but not necessarily from you or my family or anyone else. Like, I can learn from experiences from them, but my data set is strictly personal to me. And you have a fleet of vehicles that, let's take, for example, Tesla, who has, millions of vehicles on the road, and they're able to gather data from all of these vehicles to help facilitate autonomous driving. That all comes back, right? They have all these people's data that comes back and helps facilitate one brain, so that they can go update their software that contains the AI model, the AI brain, that accommodates everyone's driving habits and can drive. It's one model that has everyone's realm of thought, essentially. And so that's quite interesting from a personal standpoint, because if we were able to do that as humans, you can imagine some pros and you can also imagine some cons to that. But there's a lot of AI paves the potential for a lot of things that can be done with, in my opinion, with humans in general and the brain. And it's interesting to see if we might follow that trajectory where we can kind of, I'm able to learn from your experiences, and you're able to upload your experiences and your data set essentially to a cloud where I can use that to benefit myself, and vice versa. And we all have this kind of one hive mind that we're able to experience. So it'll be interesting to see if we kind of catapult in that direction later on.
That's an interesting topic, which I like to put a pin on. But now you're in this world of medical devices and AI, which is a very important segment to get into. Obviously, we don't want to have any margin of human error. You want to have all those surgeries precise, or diagnosis precise, and more of these AI should be getting into this space. So what got you into focusing on the medical side of things first?
So the COVID-19 pandemic really was a huge enabler for Seeker and all of our technology. We originally started in a different industry. We had a very, very good image recognition, pattern recognition platform. And we had a hard time kind of breaking in to the medical field, just because you're exactly right. The consequences are so dire if you're wrong. So if you have an image classification algorithm that is trying to detect conditions of whether or not someone has cancer, and they're wrong, either if they're wrong, if it's a false positive or false negative, those consequences are dire either way, right? You either have to send someone through chemo that doesn't need to go through it, or somebody could potentially, it could be a fatal consequence for someone who may have lived if you don't actually, if it's a false negative. So, and those are pretty sobering once you consider those in light of a designer, of an engineer, and trying to develop this AI. But, and so, physicians and medical professionals are cautious and skeptical for a very good reason. And we're trying to maybe take a bit different of an angle with it. And the COVID-19 pandemic helped enable this, in that we're trying to not be the last link in the chain. So we're trying to more of augment physicians' capabilities by giving them medical imaging products to help give them more information quickly, instead of explicitly making the last call. So instead of saying, this x-ray contains COVID-19 and pneumonia, you triage them accordingly, do what you want to do with them accordingly. Instead of doing something like that, we actually take the angle where, this x-ray contains symptoms of COVID-19 and pneumonia or whatever, and, have a second opinion on it, but it maybe doesn't need to have as much time spent on it by the radiology technician, because the AI has done the pre-screening, the pre-processing. So you basically try to take a chunk of time and optimize it and compress it. Again, augment physicians' capabilities instead of really trying to replace it and be that last link in the chain. And so taking that into light, Seeker was able to build, and it's actually a mobile app that uses a bunch of AI that is called COVID AI, and it screens for 7 different respiratory conditions in chest x-rays. So the radiology technician or the radiologist imports a chest x-ray or takes a picture of it. You can take a picture of it just with the camera, and then the AI goes through and screens for one of these 7 conditions. And if it can't find anything, it notifies the user. But this, our goal with that was to help relieve demand on some of these physicians in the pandemic, so that we could get treatment faster and kind of get more people through the door and really see people, because they're short staffed and they had high demand from the get-go. And it ended up working out pretty well. We were able to get a lot of publicity in that regard and get a lot of users and honestly help a lot of physicians from what we can tell. We donated that product entirely for the effort, so we didn't make any money, didn't intend to make any money, just really wanted to make a staple that AI designed the right way and used in the right setting can be useful for medicine, right? And we can gain trust from physicians and medical professionals if you just go about it the right way and have the right rigor.
Right. And obviously you have tons of data sets all over the world for this, right? So I guess you go about buying these data sets, or maybe they're free, and then you can start building your systems behind this.
Yeah, it's so we were able to acquire some free data sets online, and then we also acquired our own data on top of that. So in order to eliminate bias from an AI system, we don't ever take the data sets that we download as gospel truth, that they say what they are, just because in the effect that they contain an overwhelming amount of pneumonia images instead of COVID-19 images, and they say that they're half and half. That can really bias the system. Just like if, as humans, if we take, we have one angle of thought on things, it can really influence our thinking later on down the road. But so, we acquired our own data set on top of that in order to kind of augment the full capability of the model. And it was interesting because we originally built one model that just looked for everything, right? And then it wasn't very accurate. But we ended up looking into the human brain a little bit and kind of how it triages things. So as light enters your eyes and your retina, and how your brain actually starts to recognize different patterns and images. So if I'm trying to find my car in a parking lot, my brain goes through and it doesn't just try to find my car. It goes, okay, am I looking at a parking lot? Yes, I'm looking at a parking lot. Am I looking at a set of cars? Yes. And then am I looking at a car? Okay, I'm looking at one car. Is this my car? So it kind of triages things in this hierarchical fashion in order to actually find your car, instead of just looking for a needle in the haystack. And that's what we ended up doing with our model, is that we basically said, all right, where's the x-ray? Find the x-ray, take out everything else in the image, all the text, all the information we don't need. Now find the x-ray. Okay, we found the x-ray. Find the lungs. Okay, now we found the lungs and the sternum. Now segregate those two apart and look directly at those two. And so there's this hierarchical fashion of models that we were able to kind of build in this cascade manner that we tried to leverage from the design of the human brain in that regard. And it was way more successful than just building one model, which is really quite interesting in the direction of how much by default the design of AI is influenced by the design of the human brain. It just goes to show you how well our brain was designed to begin with, through whether it's evolution or religion purposes, however you believe we came about, how great the mind of a person really is designed.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I feel like it's very difficult to program. I think there's been, attempts, from, probably the late 60s trying to not augment, but replace human beings by creating these conscious AIs. And I feel like this is something that, a lot of people say it's going to be, 50 years, 70 years down the line. It's not something that we just really do right now. And now we're just really focused on specific AI, like what you're talking about is like, look at the lungs, find the same, patterns, and try to find the irregularities around it, and then that's the symptoms, or things like that, where you're very, very focused on small things. And it seems like it's going to be a major jump from going from this specific AI into general AI, where you just completely replicate the whole human mind. And it must take a lot of steps in order to get there. I mean, what do you think is necessary to even make that jump?
Right now, we're in all of our applications address narrow problems, right? Where they address very shallow problems. So we're a long way from Terminator, right? Or a long way from iRobot, something that can really act and think on its own. The steps I think that are needed to get there the first one of them is we need to be able to blend multiple capabilities together. And I'm not necessarily saying we should get there, but these are the steps I think that would take to get there. But we need to be able to blend multiple artificial intelligence models together and make them be able to cooperate with hardware very well. I think that we actually we have better progress in software and the AI part than we do with hardware, because mechanical engineering is difficult to get to respond in the way that a human does, just because we're so resilient. So to replicate human function and behavior as far as motor skills go, I think that we probably have a bigger limit on hardware and engineering in that regard. As far as the psychology goes for actually being able to replicate something, like consciousness later on, that's a pretty dicey scenario, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong, especially that human AI symbiosis, a human computer symbiosis. We've got a long ways to go. There's an interesting, the way our body's built kind of provides a good vehicle to be able to interface with machines, and that our neural system is electrical in some sense. So, it kind of being able to make sense of those electrical signals and adapt to machines is, directly with a direct mechanical integration is possible, obviously, and we're seeing companies do it today. But I think that we need to focus really on our algorithms at a fundamental level, because we see this today in systems like facial recognition, where they wrongly convict one group of people over another group of people, or they wrongly identify certain things over other certain things, and this has to do with bias in the data sets. So again, like humans are all incorporated with our own biases by default growing up, just because we're prone to thinking in the terms we can categorize with our own experiences. And the way we're building AI is in a very similar manner. So we really need to focus on the data that we're training this AI on, so that when we get to the level of being able to replicate levels such as human consciousness and these higher level human functions, that we don't have, that they're successful, and we don't have bias in the data, and we don't have bias in the way it thinks and reacts, and it's not catastrophic really in nature.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree. Well, what something that kind of popped into my head while I was listening to you is that, our brains are actually, obviously, it's a lot more complicated than we actually even think ourselves, right? We have our conscious mind, we have our subconscious mind, we have our unconscious mind, and a lot of these three minds are actually working together to perform human activity. And a lot of the memories and the experiences that we had, we don't retain all of it, but they're actually stored in our subconscious. And sometimes it just pops into our mind, or while we're dreaming, we kind of create this dream world where a lot of the things that were hidden inside our subconscious start to come out. Or I had a lot of conversations on this episode with hypnotists. So they talk about, accessing that subconscious to understand why certain things are actually coming up, while even the conscious mind doesn't even understand it. Or, I had conversations with people who teaches or provides psychedelic treatments as well. And they were talking a lot about the subconscious mind. I mean, it's not really something that I feel like, you can have a program where you can create these three levels of minds and then, make them work like human minds do. It seems like it's a very extremely difficult task where if you have an AI mind, it seems like it's going to be having one mind, right? Where all the data is still stored there. Access is super easy, but it's not as spontaneous as human minds.
Yes, I 100% agree. There's a beauty in the architecture of the human mind that I don't think we are really meant to uncover, and we're really meant to understand. And by extension of that, I don't think that we can fully replicate a human mind. I mean, it's so incredibly complex and so well designed that, you know, being able to write lines of code that can replicate it entirely, I think is pretty unlikely. And if it is likely, it's not going to happen for a long time. I think there's parts that we can emulate, like for example, you know, we're trying to emulate part of vision, the vision system, and that's one very small thing that's not even taking into consideration consciousness or previous experiences. That's just being able to recognize objects. And so it's a very, 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 very small part of the way the brain functions. And, you know, some of these computers are huge, and we have billions of times the capability of that packed into, you know, 8 to 10 pound mass that sits in our head, which is just so incredible, you know? And I think you bring up an interesting point where we're kind of designing AI to, in general, be one model, and the brain has kind of three different. You said the subconscious, the consciousness, and then there was one other thing that you mentioned.
The unconscious.
The unconscious, yeah. So, like, how do you design that in software to, you know, try to simulate something similar? And that's quite interesting. You know, I was reading a paper a few weeks ago in which the author was talking about if AI systems got to the point where we could, you know, they were higher functional and they could actually perform more tasks that a human could, that they would have to sleep. They would have to have a period where they're not really turned off, but they are in a sleepful state, a restful state, so that they can make sense of all the data they've acquired throughout the day, right? And they can adjust their data sets, adjust their, I'm going to quote, air quotes, consciousness accordingly, right? Even though it's nothing like a human's consciousness, but they need to have that period where they can reset, recategorize, and kind of filter through all their experiences throughout the day. And it's interesting that, you know, I've never thought of sleep in that regard. Like when I go to sleep every night, it's, you know, you're tired or whatever, but being able to make sense of what you learned throughout the day, and the fact that your mind automatically does that and it shuts certain parts off and turns other parts on is such a beautiful thing. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating too. And I had another episode about lucid dreaming where you can actually wake yourself during your sleep and then access your subconscious mind and then deal with like trauma, or it can even be fun things like we were talking about, you know, flying, you know, using our imagination and kind of designing it in your sleep and in your dreams, and then acting out in that certain way. So, you know, I think this is like a really, you know, exciting topic to go like really understand the human mind, and it just goes beyond like technology. It's really the whole consciousness topic that, you know, it's something that, you know, in the new world or the next generation of the world, this is something that to be really interesting to go after and research about. And, you know, I think that's, you know, just, you know, away from the whole AI kind of things, is that, you know, our, you know, kind of human life form, it was really designed very magically in that sense. It's almost like a, you know, miraculous kind of creature, right? In a way that we are not always peaceful. You know, we act in a very malicious way. We can act in a very generous way. You know, we try to create peace, but yet we still can't do it. I mean, it's a very imbalanced mind, and, you know, having robots to be able to do that, it doesn't seem like it's just possible, because they're going to be extremely logical about these things. But anyway, we need to talk about that kind of topic forever. But in the sense of like, you know, we're talking about AI and specific things, and you mentioned about people losing jobs and etc. What I also think about certain existential threats about having AI in a world is that I feel like we're going to rely on it so much that we can't really think for ourselves anymore. So in the crypto world that I live in, there's this concept where platforms being created called decentralized finance, where you don't need regulations, you don't need human biases to tell you who gets a loan, who doesn't. Everything's done by code, where everybody has equal access, and you can trust it because there's no human intervention in it whatsoever. And I think a lot of the younger generations are really getting excited about it because of those particular reasons. It's fair. You really know what you're getting. There's nothing behind closed doors. But at the same time, the dependency on technology is also something that I actually worry about. So let's say all these AIs started creating, policies. This is a good policy for, creating peace, or, reducing famine, or all these things. Don't you think we'll get too reliant on technology that we can't live without it anymore? Just like our smartphones, we can't live without our smartphones anymore, right? So, that's kind of what I worry, is that can we maintain our humanity in a sense that, we are, in a way sovereign in ourselves and not too reliant on what, technology has created?
Yes, it's just because we can do something doesn't necessarily mean we should. So if we have the capability later on down the road to simulate human consciousness, and we continue to try to replicate human behavior and human capabilities through and better engineering and artificial intelligence, then that doesn't necessarily mean that we should, because at that point you kind of take the humanity out of it, right? Why would we try to replicate ourselves in a machine form? You might want to try to, I agree with the fact that we want to try to maybe replicate some capabilities in the sense of maybe a humanoid form, or to have some characteristics of a human in order to accomplish certain tasks. So again, I don't think that we should develop it towards the idea of eliminating jobs, but augmenting humans' capabilities. So where there are instances where human safety could be violated, or human safety is of a concern, or it might be safer. Just there's a risk assessment that suggests that it's maybe too risky to send a human in. That's, I think, where AI can come in handy, right? And again, why would you, if you develop that to emulate a human, then you essentially you're just replicating the problem. You're sending something that you view as human into a risky situation, which kind of, violates our humanitarian sense, right? And so I don't think that we should really replicate humans to a full degree, because we would take the humanity out of it, and it would violate, I think, partially our sovereign rights, and it would violate kind of how we interact as humans. But on the thread of if we become too dependent on technology, it is kind of a scary thing, because I even notice each generation I talk to, like my grandfather and my father, I always learn a lot when I talk to them, or grandparents and parents in general. But you notice they always give the quote, back in my day it was like this, back in my day I didn't, and it's part of that. I always notice that any back in my day conversation is always directly impacted by technology. So technology always brings that conversation up, and it's they had way less technology back in that day. And to be honest, if I had to go back and try to navigate my way through New York City without my GPS or without my phone, right? I wouldn't be able to do it. And so that's that's one task out of hundreds that we rely on our phones on throughout the day. So if it's interesting, if we were totally to, abolish technology, or something happened where we, all power was cut out, how would we function as a society? And, you'd have to, it's interesting, because you kind of have to my one way I've thought about helping solve this is if we build society so that it's really dependent on things that are engraved on our human nature by default, right? But technology kind of violates all human nature by default, right? It's basically the antithesis of nature. So in order to make progress in technology, we need to find a way to not make anti-progress in maintaining our sovereign rights and maintaining our humanity. So there's this yin and yang that I hope is able to be established and doesn't just become explicitly a yin or explicitly a yang, right? So it's an interesting problem, and I hope that we can kind of try to find a hybrid way to go about it.
Yeah, one of the things that I do regret not learning about is being able to fix a car. I think I've seen like movies and back in the day where, these people would open up the bonnet of the car, go in there, fix it. This thing is, the screw is off, or the conveyor belt is off, or something like that. And I pop up the car and look inside. I have absolutely no clue what's going on there, right? So in a way that we have actually kind of released this information about, machines in that sense. Well, I'm just talking about a car in specific here, that because there are companies that do that for us, or even if you look at factories nowadays, obviously everybody knows there's no people in there, right? Robotics is taking care of everything. So we actually lose that capability to be able to interact with certain things. And I feel like as we progress using AI or whatever it is, there's going to be a lot less of us that we actually lose, or not in terms of knowledge, that we can't really get back anymore. One of the examples of human evolution is that when we had absolutely nothing, we were cavemen, we were able to kind of see the sky, smell this, the air, look at the way, birds are chirping or whatever it is. And we actually knew what kind of weather it's going to be. Or we'd be walking down the forest. We knew exactly what not to eat, what to eat, all these things. And we were completely, ingrained with nature. And we're completely now, polar opposite. We don't even know what the heck we need an app to scan what a plant is and tell us what exactly that is, right? So, yeah. so I feel like, we're losing a lot of knowledge and just kind of, hoping that technology will replace that for us. And we're doing more and more of that as we kind of add more technologies into our life. I mean, I just feel like that's the worry, is like, there will be a time where we can't just do anything. We're just sitting on floating chairs, cruising through, and everything's just done for us, right? And that's kind of like the dystopian kind of future that I do want to avoid for humankind.
Yeah, I definitely agree. There should be, like, there should be like a mandatory class you have to take is, each year is in like grade school and in high school, in which you have like, I don't know if we call it a survivability course, but like something that you, like a human nature course, where we have to go back and not use any technology, but just basically be able to prove that we can have basic survival capabilities or basic, communication capabilities without any technology being used. Because yeah, I mean, we will lose it, right? And we slowly are. And it's like AI right now is getting a lot of publicity for because it's being able to, replicate certain aspects of what the human does. But if you look back through time, like start with the wheel. The wheel was invented to try to augment human capabilities and moving faster, right? And then that eventually, it probably started with the horse, right? And then the wheel. And so basically vehicles were an extension, an AI in some regard, and being able to, or technological advancement and being able to make us move faster. And then we move forward, you can look at the speaker, right? It's a replication of the human ear, or a microphone is a replication of the human ear. Speakers are a replication of human voice in some degree. And so we have all these different devices and all these different products throughout time that have like tried to replicate different aspects of human nature. And it's just like, are we going to continue inevitably until the point where we just replicate ourselves entirely through machines, or are we going to stop at some point and sober up and say, okay, we have the capability to do this, but that doesn't mean we should. Like maybe we should just maintain our humanity and stop here. It's kind of it's an interesting problem that needs to be solved, right? It needs to be, maybe it's not addressed by our generation, but it should be addressed starting with our generation, so that mentality is carried throughout time to the point where when it does become, when we do have the capabilities to do such things, we've at least had those conversations and it's not a crisis moment.
Yeah, I have two kids who are 7 and 4, and they can't live without technology, right? They're so used to their YouTubes, they can't get bored. They don't want to be bored. I remember back in my time, I used to daydream, right? I used to daydream and think about like my future self and what I'm going to be doing and this and that. But if these kids don't have time to be bored, what can they actually, create? What kind of creativity can they have? Now all the schools are thinking, oh, we have to teach kids coding. We have to, make them creative, and all these like ideas around like what the future is going to be, and trying to implement all these type of things so that they can survive in the future. But at the same time, I feel like you have to, as you say, you have to bring them back to a human level and then experience what a human's supposed to be without technology. And that's really important to me. And then I want to go back to where I pinned it with the conversation with you, is that, now we're, a lot of people are talking about singularity, being one with the computers and augmenting us in everyday lives. And that was something that you thought, would happen in the future. I mean, so how does that kind of, mesh with the concepts that we've been talking about?
So the singularity to me is really, when we get to that point, we'll have some significant capabilities in replicating consciousness in some degree. And you basically approach this level of humanity where everyone has the same capabilities. Everyone, might look the same, right? Like if we can increase one human's capability to run at 100 meters per second, then why wouldn't we increase everyone's capabilities to do that, right? And so we just have this copy and pasted humanity, right? This copy and pasted form of humanity where everyone thinks the same, acts the same, has one hive mind. If we get to the point where you can interface your consciousness and your thoughts with the cloud or with internet capabilities, and everything you think about is just synchronized to the cloud, right? And everyone else can leverage from your expertise or the way you think or the experience you just had. That becomes pretty concerning, because you can imagine how drastic that could be if the control of that was under a bad actor or a very bad power, right? Whoever owns that server that has everyone's thoughts synchronized, right? The storage of everyone's thoughts, and I mean, you can basically control people. You can control motor abilities, motor skills, and so that's a pretty scary scenario. And I think like that conversation needs to start before that happens. It shouldn't start when we have the capability. It should start now and say, okay, we're making progress towards this, thing that could potentially end humanity as we know it. Let's put some principles into, or some restrictions into play that can maybe limit how bad that can be, and really limit the bad potential that can come out of it, to try to influence that trajectory to be very good. And again, I think that goes back to maybe not trying to replicate everything that a human can do, and maintaining our humanity. And I mean, right now, some of the existential threats, I mean, maybe not existential threats today, but the ways AI has the potential to drastically impact humanity today, I don't think is in the form of Terminator and iRobot. I think it's more of in the form like the stock market, right? Like the flash crash a few years ago, where the computers crashed the stock market for a brief few minutes, right? And then it came back up. Those are the types of things like that I'm concerned about, where a rogue AI stock market trading algorithm sells or liquidates everyone's portfolios and decides to put it into a rogue bank account, right? And everyone wakes up and has no more money in their bank account. It's like, well, that's probably pretty possible today. Or someone's Teslas all get hacked. Everyone's Teslas get hacked, and they decide to drive it off the East Coast, and there's nothing you can do to control your car. Like, those are the types of things those would be pretty bad if they happen, and AI probably has the capability to do, in the near future, like very near future. So putting some ethics into play and putting some principles into the play that can limit those types of scenarios, I think could, catapult or cascade up later on in time, where when we do have some more sobering conversations about the singularity, it's we've got some actions in play that can kind of limit how bad that can actually be.
Yeah. No, I did have this conversation with one of the guests that we had named Peter Voss, who was also creating like these AI chatbots. And we were talking about, are there any, who actually sets these standards of ethics for AI anyway? I mean, yeah, you can find people that want to talk about it, form a committee, lay down the regulations around it. But ultimately, they're not voted by people. They're not politicians. They're not. I don't think even politicians should be doing it either. But it's just hard to think of like who is the right person to think about. There's no such thing as like a high level ethical person in this world that everybody knows, right? I mean, and it's always going to be biased in some way. So that's where I kind of a little bit stumble upon is like how do we even make this AI even better and better, but still allow us to keep our ethical values and keep that standard high as possible, because with all things in technology for these days, I mean a lot of things do turn into kind of by polar kind of things. Like social media was supposed to connect people, but also created propaganda and misinformation, all these things. And if I was Mark Zuckerberg, in the beginning, he probably didn't even think about this, right? He wasn't supposed to be like a printing press or something that had to think about what kind of content should be on Facebook. I mean, it was not his job to think about it. It's still probably not his job, but that's what he fell into, right, for creating. So I think in terms of AI as well, is like we are creating this. Everybody's excited, advancing these things, but there's no, every step of the way, I always feel like needs to be like checkpoints.
Right. Yeah, I 100% agree. Right now, there's significant AI investment and significant AI focus by some big players in the market like Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, etc. And cryptocurrency is really kind of really painted a good picture in my opinion for being able to decentralize things and being able to decentralize finance, and people are accepting of it. People are on board and they love it, and I think that's important because it's taking power away from a concentrated few players and distributing that amount around to everybody, or at least a larger number of smaller players, in which it limits the ability of bad actors making a big impact. Now, we can do the same thing with AI, and I don't think any of these companies have any malicious intent right now, but if you look forward into the future and AI is concentrated and one person or a few big global entities control all of artificial intelligence, that could be pretty bad. And so it would be good to follow a blockchain approach, right? A decentralized crypto approach where AI is in some degree, and I'm not exactly sure what the right way would be to go about it, but it's in some way decentralized so that it limits the potential of one player to ruin it for everybody. It limits the potential of one bad actor to compromise the entire system. So there's a lot of interesting things with crypto that are going on that I think that should influence the way other things are developed in the future, and AI is definitely one of them. Try to put more democracy into it and democratize, because if you democratize AI in the future, that is tantamount to democratizing power and democratizing data and democratizing freedom. Because again, alluding back to some of the rogue facial recognition systems, if we're allowing algorithms to make these decisions, that takes humanity out of these decisions that probably should have humanity involved for sure, right? And if you can imagine that on a larger scale, you definitely don't want that power in the hands of a select few people. You want that distributed to several people, several AI agents, right? So you democratize power in some regard. So I really hope that this trend with crypto continues in several different industries.
Yeah, and then going forward, I mean, how would you like to run CCAR in that aspect then?
So we have a focus on ethical and explainable AI and mobile AI. So those are the three principles that we build all of our products on. So we have a very strict focus on ethics and making sure that our AI is ethical, and that what I mean by that is that we try to avoid situations like facial recognition right now where there's as much bias eliminated from the data set as possible, and we have domain experts come in and review our data sets and help us acquire more data, make sure they're balanced, bias is rid from the system as much as possible. And we also have people come in from several different disciplines and angles to try to give a different look at the data and how it could potentially hurt or hinder people. Another thing we do in regards to ethics is we try to make sure that if we work on a product, should the problem be solved by AI? Should we allow this system that is inherently black box by nature, right now at least, to solve this problem. What are the consequences of this model being wrong, and evaluate how that might affect somebody's life, or if it's relatively simple, like the consequences of an AI model being wrong on social media by tagging somebody inappropriately, or tagging the wrong person in a photo, is way less severe than AI being used. The consequences of someone being mistagged in a photo by AI is way less severe than the consequences of artificial intelligence being wrong in medicine or defense or something like that. And so making sure that those data sets are pure and rid of bias as much as possible is important. Another thing that we're doing that's, I think, that's particular to Seeker is explainability. So trying to make sure that we can explain these AI models appropriately. One way to gain trust in the way AI can work and gain trust in its capabilities in other domains where people are very skeptical is making sure that AI can explain itself just as a human can. So in the example that I gave where we developed that X-ray that medical recognition software for X-rays, we were able to actually explain how the algorithm got to its resolution. So the engineer on our end got a feedback report about exactly how the algorithm behaved, and then the physician gets a report saying, these are the things that I identified that make me think that there's COVID-19 within this chest X-ray. And so that's very important because you add some level of humanity back in by being able to say, here's what I believe. Am I wrong or am I right? Or take this with a grain of salt and saying, instead of saying, here's all this data, I made a decision. Don't worry about how I made the decision, but I made the decision. And that's very important because, again, that allows us to develop trust with some critics and some skeptics within the industry, allows them to have access to the capabilities that have massive potential with AI, but also adds some human rights. I feel like if we're going to allow AI to be such a big part of our lives, we need to understand what's going on, why the decision is being made in the way it is, and why things are happening, if we're going to have algorithms and tech be such a huge part of our life.
Yeah, I totally agree. Now, well, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed our conversation, and maybe we can do a follow-up in like a year's time and see where you're at, how this world of AI is being created. We'll probably have a lot more information by then as well. So again, thank you so much for your time, Cordell.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. And I'm a big fan of your show. So I really, really appreciate it. Thank you.